Ethan slid the folder across the polished mahogany table, as if he were offering me dessert instead of dismantling my life. The conference room in downtown Scottsdale was too cold, the air humming softly above us. I could smell leather and paper and something faintly metallic, like tension had its own scent. Patricia sat to Ethan's right, pearls resting neatly against her navy silk blouse, her hands folded in patient expectation. Daniel Harper, our longtime estate planning lawyer, adjusted his glasses and opened the file without expression. Ethan's smile was calm, confident, the kind he used when closing a deal. "This is just restructuring," he said softly. "Temporary. It protects us." I looked down at the bold heading. Asset Transfer and Protective Assignment Agreement. My name was already typed beneath a clean signature line. He believed I would sign. He believed I had no choice. The lawsuit pressure. The Christmas fundraiser. The whispers about stability. He thought he had backed me into a corner so tight I wouldn't even try to step out. What he didn't know was that something buried in those papers was about to make his own lawyer turn pale. And when Daniel's eyes stopped on a single clause halfway down the stack, I saw it happen. The shift. My inheritance wasn't abstract. It wasn't numbers on a screen. Nearly $900,000 from my grandmother's estate sat in a separate account under my name alone. A portion had been structured through an irrevocable trust she set up years before she passed. I also held a minority share in the Sedona Boutique Hotel that had been in my family for decades. Separate property. Protected. Personal. Ethan leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, with the development partner threatening a lawsuit, he said, glancing briefly at Daniel. "We need to show consolidated stability. Moving Lauren's inheritance into my mother's foundation shields it from unnecessary scrutiny." Foundation. Shield. Stability. Words that sounded noble. Responsible. Patricia nodded slowly. "It's about legacy," she added. "Unity." I kept my voice even. "Why is my inheritance tied to your commercial development dispute?" Ethan's hand brushed my knee under the table. A silent warning. "It's not tied," he said smoothly. "It's preventative. Judges can freeze marital assets in messy litigation. This is strategic." Daniel flipped another page. His brow tightened almost imperceptibly. I noticed attachments clipped behind the transfer agreement, documents I hadn't seen before. A security agreement. A collateral disclosure form. My name appeared again, this time in smaller print. Connected to a commercial loan linked to Ethan's newest Scottsdale property. A quiet pulse began in my throat. "When did I agree to this?" I asked. Ethan exhaled a short laugh. "Lauren, you approved the digital authorization months ago. It was routine. Spousal confirmation. Routine." The word echoed in my head. Daniel paused on a page near the back of the file. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said carefully, "did you knowingly authorize your inheritance account to be listed as secondary collateral on a commercial loan?" The room seemed to shrink. "I don't remember doing that," I said. Ethan's smile thinned. It was a click-through confirmation. "You remember. I showed you." Something about the way Daniel's fingers tightened against the paper made my stomach drop. He reached for his laptop and pulled up what looked like an authorization log. "This shows a digital signature executed at 11:58 p.m. From a residential IP address?" he said slowly. "Linked to your guarantor acknowledgement. Midnight." A flicker of memory surfaced. Ethan standing beside our bed months ago, holding out his tablet. I had been half asleep. He'd said he just needed me to confirm receipt of an investor disclosure. I remember tapping where he pointed without reading. At the time, I trusted him. Daniel adjusted his glasses again, scanning further. The collateral filing references both a personal account and an asset structure connected to an irrevocable trust. The word trust landed heavily. Patricia straightened. "Surely that's just internal structuring," she said. Daniel did not answer her immediately. He read the clause again. Then he looked up at me. "Were you represented by independent counsel when you authorized this collateral?" "No," I said quietly. Ethan's voice sharpened. We don't need independent counsel. We're married. Daniel's expression shifted, subtle, but undeniable. The confident neutrality he'd worn at the beginning of the meeting was gone. In its place was something more cautious, almost alarmed. I need to clarify something, he said, closing the folder halfway. If an inheritance structured as separate property through a trust is being leveraged as loan collateral without fully informed consent, that raises serious concerns. Ethan leaned forward. Concerns about what? Daniel didn't look at him. He looked at me. Concerns about authorization. And timing. The air conditioning hummed louder. Or maybe I was just hearing my own pulse. For now, Daniel continued carefully. I cannot proceed with any transfer of assets until we review the underlying collateral documentation in full. Ethan's jaw tightened. This is overcautious. Daniel's eyes returned to the authorization log on his screen. His face lost color by degrees. I don't believe it is, he said quietly. That was the moment I understood. This meeting wasn't about protecting my inheritance from a lawsuit. It was about protecting Ethan from something he had already done with it. And whatever Daniel had just seen, it was serious enough to make even his own lawyer afraid. Daniel's hesitation in that conference room did not begin that morning. It began 6 months earlier, the day the wire from my grandmother's estate cleared into my account. I remember sitting at our kitchen island, staring at the confirmation notice. Nearly $900,000. A lifetime of careful saving, of motel bookkeeping and handwritten ledgers from a woman who never trusted debt. Part of it was placed inside an irrevocable trust she had established years ago. The rest transferred directly to me. Separate property. She had made that clear in her will long before she passed. Ethan had wrapped his arms around me that night. I'm proud of you, he'd said. Your grandmother believed in you. At the time, I believed him too. For the first few weeks. Nothing felt different. We talked about investing carefully. Maybe renovating my minority share of the Sedona boutique hotel that had been in my family for decades. I owned a small percentage. Enough to matter, but not enough to control. Still, it was mine. A quiet piece of history that didn't carry the Whitfield name. Ethan ran his own development projects tied loosely to that hospitality world. Commercial expansions. Mixed-use properties. Bigger risks. Then the language began to shift. It started with legacy. My mother-in-law, Patricia, invited me to lunch at the country club one afternoon. She wore cream linen and that same pearl bracelet she wore to every foundation meeting. The Whitfield Foundation is expanding, she said, stirring her iced tea slowly. We're building something that will last generations. Legacy matters. She mentioned my inheritance casually, as if it were a shared family resource instead of something my grandmother had built with her own hands. It would be beautiful, Patricia continued, if your assets were aligned with ours. It sends a message of unity. Unity. That word followed me home. A week later, at a planning dinner for the annual Christmas fundraiser, my sister-in-law made a joke that didn't feel like one. Looks like Lauren's finally pulling her weight, she said, smiling too brightly. $900,000 does wonders for commitment. The table laughed. I wasn't excluded outright. I was just subtly repositioned, from family member to strategic asset. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table that night. They don't mean anything by it, he whispered. It's just family drama. But it didn't feel harmless. Around the same time, Ethan began mentioning a minor dispute with one of his development partners. He called it noise. Routine negotiation tension. Sometimes investors threaten a lawsuit just to get leverage, he said casually one evening as we reviewed seating charts for the fundraiser. It won't go anywhere. He mentioned that in high-stakes litigation, judges could freeze marital assets during review. It's procedural, he explained. Even separate property can get dragged into the conversation while things are sorted out. I remember frowning. My inheritance is structured separately. He smiled patiently. You don't fully understand how aggressive commercial litigation works. There was no anger in his voice. Just gentle dismissal. That was the first time I felt something that resembled financial coercion, though I didn't have a name for it yet. Then came the night with the tablet. It was close to midnight. I had already fallen asleep when Ethan shook my shoulder lightly. "Babe, I just need you to confirm receipt of an investor disclosure," he murmured, holding his tablet toward me. "It's routine compliance stuff." The screen was bright. My eyes burned. "Where do I click?" I asked. "Just there," he said, tapping near the bottom. I remember touching the screen and rolling back onto my pillow. At the time, I trusted him completely. Weeks passed. The foundation board intensified its push for expansion. The Christmas fundraiser was shaping up to be the largest in years. 2 major donors, including a retired judge and a real estate investor from Phoenix, were scheduled to attend. Optics matter. Patricia reminded me during a planning call. Families that appear divided lose credibility. That sentence stayed with me. One afternoon, Ethan floated the idea more directly. "If we temporarily assign your inheritance into a protective structure under Mom's foundation, it strengthens our financial posture," he said. "It shows consolidated stability while the dispute settles." "I don't want my grandmother's money mixed into foundation accounts," I replied. "It wouldn't be mixed," he insisted. "It's strategic placement. Protection. Protection." I wanted to believe that word, but something about the urgency felt disproportionate to a minor dispute. The first real crack appeared at another foundation dinner. Patricia thanked Ethan publicly for securing additional family commitment ahead of the expansion announcement. I felt heat rise in my face. No one had discussed anything with me formally. Later that night, when I asked Ethan what she meant, he brushed it off. "She's speaking aspirationally," he said. "Relax." But now, sitting in that lawyer's conference room months later, watching Daniel's expression shift as he read through the collateral documents, the pieces began to align. The midnight click, the sudden emphasis on unity, the repeated references to lawsuit exposure and judges freezing assets, the subtle repositioning of my inheritance from personal legacy to strategic shield. Daniel looked at me over the top of the folder and asked whether I had knowingly authorized my account as collateral. In that moment, I realized something I had refused to consider before. The meeting wasn't the beginning of the pressure. It was the cleanup. And whatever had happened that night with the tablet might have been the first move in a plan I never agreed to. I left Daniel's office with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Ethan walked beside me through the marble lobby as if nothing unusual had happened. His hand rested lightly at the small of my back, guiding me toward the exit like we were just another polished couple finishing a routine appointment with our lawyer. "That was overcautious," he said once we reached the parking garage. "Daniel sees liability ghosts everywhere." I stopped beside the car. "Why does my name appear on a collateral filing?" He exhaled slowly, the way he did when I misunderstood something simple. "It's a spousal guarantor acknowledgement. Standard practice. It doesn't mean they're taking your inheritance." "You said this was about protection," I said. "Not collateral. It is protection," he snapped, irritation flickering across his face. "Lauren, there's a lawsuit threat hanging over my development project. If a judge freezes accounts during review, we need to look consolidated and secure." There it was again. Lawsuit. Judge. Urgency. He opened my door before I could respond. The conversation ended not with resolution, but with his quiet expectation that I would let it go. That night, the house felt different. Bigger. Colder. Ethan retreated into his office and closed the door. I stood in the kitchen staring at the granite countertops, replaying Daniel's words in my mind. Secondary collateral. Irrevocable trust. Authorization log. Around 9 that evening, Ethan came out with his phone pressed to his ear. He didn't see me standing at the end of the hallway. "Yes, mediation is still on the calendar," he said in a low voice. "No, the guarantor issue is under control." Guarantor issue. I stepped back into the shadows before he noticed me. Later, when he joined me in the living room, he acted relaxed again. "It's just business pressure," he said, stretching his arms along the back of the couch. You're reading too much into it. How much is the dispute for? I asked. He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. It's fluid, he said. These things always are. He didn't answer the question. 2 days later, Patricia called. We need to talk about the Christmas fundraiser, she said. Her tone polished and controlled. Donors are sensitive to instability. If there's hesitation about restructuring assets, it could look like division. I'm not restructuring anything until I understand what's happening, I said. There was a pause. You don't want to appear excluded from family decisions, she replied gently. Legacy requires participation. Excluded. The word lodged in my chest like a splinter. That evening, after Ethan went to bed, I opened my laptop and logged into the shared business drive he'd given me access to months earlier when I helped with marketing materials for the family business. I searched for my name. It appeared more times than I expected. One file stopped me cold. Commercial Loan Security Agreement, Scottsdale Expansion. I opened it. Halfway down the document, under Guarantor Acknowledgement, was my name. My digital signature sat beneath it. The date matched the night Ethan had handed me his tablet while I was half asleep. My stomach turned. I scrolled further. The agreement referenced specific collateral accounts, including an account number that matched my inheritance deposit. My inheritance, used as backing for his commercial development loan. I leaned back in my chair, the room spinning slightly. This wasn't about protective restructuring. This was about exposure. The next morning, I confronted him in the kitchen. You used my inheritance as collateral, I said quietly. He didn't look surprised. It's temporary leverage, he replied, pouring coffee. That's how high-level development works. You told me it was protected. It is protected, he said sharply. Do you think I'd risk everything? This is financial alignment, not theft. The word theft hadn't crossed my lips, but now it echoed between us. You had me click something without explaining it, I said. That wasn't informed consent. It was routine authorization, he shot back. Every married couple shares risk. That's what partnership means. Partnership. I felt something inside me shift. This is financial coercion, I said slowly. You're using pressure and urgency to push me into legitimizing something I didn't agree to. He laughed once, short and humorless. Now you're dramatizing it. But his eyes were no longer calm. That afternoon, I called the bank listed on the loan document. I kept my voice steady. I'd like to confirm whether I'm listed as a guarantor on a commercial loan tied to a Scottsdale development. The representative placed me on hold. When she returned, her tone was professional and neutral. Yes, Mrs. Whitfield, you are listed as secondary guarantor. Would you like a copy of the original authorization file? My pulse hammered in my ears. Yes, I said. There was a pause as she typed. I'll send it to the email associated with your guarantor profile. When I hung up, I sat there staring at my phone. The meeting with Daniel hadn't been about moving my inheritance into Patricia's foundation for protection. It had been about covering the fact that it was already tied to a loan. And if the bank was now reviewing authorization logs because of lender scrutiny tied to mediation, then Ethan's urgency made sense in a way that chilled me. He didn't need my signature for a new transfer. He needed it to legitimize what he had already done. And for the first time since my grandmother's will had been read, I felt something sharper than fear. I felt betrayal. Daniel asked Ethan and Patricia to step outside for a moment, and the door clicked shut with a softness that felt louder than any argument. The silence that followed pressed against my ribs. He folded his hands on the table and looked at me without the polite detachment he'd worn at the beginning of the meeting. I need to ask you directly, he said. Did you knowingly authorize your inheritance account to be listed as collateral on your husband's commercial loan? No, I said. My voice didn't shake. I don't remember approving anything like that. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. The metadata attached to this authorization, he continued, turning his laptop slightly so I could see, shows a digital confirmation at 11:58 p.m. From a shared residential IP address. There's no secondary authentication. No independent verification. My mouth went dry. That was the night he asked me to click something on his tablet. I whispered. Daniel's jaw tightened. If a digital signature was obtained without full disclosure of what you were authorizing, that raises serious concerns, he said carefully, particularly when the asset involved is structured as separate property through a trust. The word trust landed heavily in the room. And now, he added, tapping the folder, I'm being asked to facilitate a transfer of those same assets into a foundation account while there is a pending lawsuit and scheduled mediation involving your husband's development partner. I stared at the document in front of me. So the transfer, I said slowly, would make it look like the collateral was properly positioned from the beginning. He didn't answer directly. It would complicate the timeline, he said instead. The door opened. Ethan stepped back inside, Patricia following close behind. Well, Ethan asked, his tone tight. Can we move forward? Daniel closed the laptop. I cannot proceed with any asset transfer at this time, he said evenly. There are inconsistencies that require clarification. Ethan's expression hardened. Inconsistencies about what? About authorization, Daniel replied. And timing. Patricia's brows drew together. This is internal structuring. Surely we don't need to escalate language. This is not escalation, Daniel said calmly. It is compliance. He turned back to Ethan. When exactly did you inform your wife that her inheritance would be used as secondary collateral for your Scottsdale expansion loan? Ethan exhaled sharply. We discussed alignment months ago. That is not the question I asked, Daniel said. The room felt smaller by the second. There was a digital acknowledgement. Ethan insisted. She approved it. Daniel met my eyes. Did you review the security agreement before clicking? No, I said. Ethan's voice sharpened. You're making this sound criminal. Daniel didn't flinch. If an asset structured through an irrevocable trust is leveraged without fully informed consent, and then subsequently moved in response to lender scrutiny, it can create the appearance of fraudulent conveyance. The word fraudulent hung in the air like smoke. Patricia shifted in her chair. Are you suggesting my son committed fraud? I'm suggesting, Daniel replied carefully, that we need transparency before any additional transactions occur. Ethan stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. It's business pressure. Investors threaten litigation all the time. Your mediation is in 2 weeks, Daniel said. And your collateral structure is under review. Those facts are not irrelevant. I felt something settle inside me. A clarity that hadn't been there before. Did you use my inheritance to secure your project? I asked Ethan directly. He didn't answer immediately. It was for us, he said finally. For the family business. For stability. My grandmother's money is not your safety net, I said quietly. It's our marriage, he shot back. There's no such thing as separate property when you're building a life together. Daniel's expression tightened at that. In Arizona, he said calmly, there is absolutely such a thing as separate property, especially when reinforced by trust structure. Ethan's face flushed. Patricia looked between us, her composure thinning. Perhaps we should handle this privately, she murmured. Before rumors affect the Christmas fundraiser. There it was again. Optics. Reputation. Unity. Daniel closed the folder firmly. I will not facilitate a transfer that may be interpreted as an attempt to reposition assets after disputed collateral authorization, he said. If you wish to proceed, Mrs. Whitfield should have independent counsel. Ethan stared at him. You represent this family. I represent the integrity of the transaction, Daniel replied. The room went silent. As we stood to leave, Daniel touched my arm lightly. Mrs. Whitfield, he said. Would you mind staying behind for a brief moment? Ethan's jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle flex. In that instant, I understood something with painful clarity. This wasn't just about my inheritance. This was about control. And for the first time since the word lawsuit entered our home, the control was no longer entirely in Ethan's hands. Daniel waited until the door closed behind Ethan and Patricia before he spoke again. His voice lowered, no longer carrying the formal cadence of a conference table discussion. "I need you to understand the position this puts you in," he said. I remained seated, my hands folded tightly in my lap. "The digital authorization attached to that commercial loan does not follow standard dual authentication protocol," he continued. "There's no secondary confirmation email, no independent timestamp verification beyond the device access. That alone raises concern." My throat tightened. "Concern about what?" "About whether you knowingly consented," he said, "and whether the lender was given accurate representation of that consent." The word representation felt heavier than accusation. "If your inheritance, particularly the portion structured through an irrevocable trust, was used as collateral without informed approval, that could be interpreted as misrepresentation," he said carefully. "And if the current transfer into your mother-in-law's foundation is intended to reposition those assets while mediation is pending, that creates additional legal exposure. So signing today would," I swallowed, "fix it. It could make it appear ratified," he said. "Which may not serve your interests." "My interests." I hadn't thought about them clearly in weeks. Everything had been framed as us. Family unity. Stability. Protection. Daniel leaned back slightly. "There is a mediation scheduled between your husband and his development partner, correct?" "Yes." "And lenders have begun reviewing collateral stability." I nodded. "In that context," he said, "the timing of this transfer request is not neutral." I stared at the grain of the table, tracing the lines with my eyes. "You should retain independent counsel," he added. Immediately, the word independent felt like stepping into cold water. When Ethan returned, his composure was brittle. "Well?" he demanded. Daniel stood. "I cannot proceed with any asset transfer today. There are compliance concerns that require clarification." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're overcomplicating this." "I disagree," Daniel replied evenly. The meeting ended without signatures. In the parking garage, Ethan's restraint fractured. "You blindsided me," he snapped once we were inside the car. "I answered a question honestly," I said. "You made it sound like I tricked you." "Didn't you?" He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. "It was standard spousal authorization," he said through clenched teeth. "You clicked approval. I didn't know what I was approving. That's not my fault." The words hung between us like shattered glass. That night, after he went to bed, I opened my grandmother's trust documents and read every line for the first time since her funeral. There it was, a clause requiring notification to the trustee if any beneficiary asset was encumbered or pledged without explicit informed consent. Encumbered. My inheritance account had been listed as collateral. I felt something shift inside me, not panic, not rage. Clarity. The next morning, I scheduled a consultation with an independent lawyer specializing in financial fraud and marital asset disputes. Saying the words out loud to the receptionist made my hands tremble. Fraud. Marital asset disputes. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with an email notification from the bank. Updated collateral documentation requires guarantor acknowledgement. My pulse spiked. I opened the attachment. It was the same commercial loan security agreement, only this version included a revised digital signature log. The timestamp had been reformatted. The routing information slightly altered. It looked cleaner, more defensible. I stared at the screen, nausea rising in my throat. He was modifying the paper trail. I walked into his office without knocking. "Why is the bank sending me revised collateral documentation?" I asked. He looked up slowly. Too slowly. "It's administrative cleanup," he said. "They changed the authorization record. That's normal." After Daniel raised concerns, his eyes flashed. "You're spiraling," he said. "Investors are nervous. Lenders are cautious. That doesn't mean anyone committed fraud." The word hung in the room between us. "I didn't agree to pledge my inheritance," I said quietly. "It was temporary leverage," he replied. "For the family business." For you, I corrected. His silence confirmed more than any confession could. You're jeopardizing everything, he said finally. If lenders pull support before mediation, the entire project collapses. And you think risking my separate property without telling me is acceptable? I asked. He stood up, frustration radiating from him. I thought you trusted me. I met his gaze. I did? The difference between past and present trust felt like a physical tear. That evening, my independent attorney called me back. I've reviewed the preliminary documents you sent, she said. If the digital authorization lacks proper authentication, and if asset repositioning occurred after lender scrutiny began, there may be grounds to challenge the collateral filing. Challenge. The word felt powerful. And if I refuse to sign the transfer? I asked. Then the original authorization will stand or fall on its own merits, she said. But signing now could complicate your ability to contest it later. I ended the call and sat alone at the kitchen island where I had once celebrated my inheritance. It no longer felt like a gift. It felt like evidence. Ethan walked in quietly. You're making this bigger than it needs to be, he said. No, I replied, my voice steady. You already did that. My phone buzzed again. A second email from the bank. Revised guarantor acknowledgement pending confirmation. I stared at the screen. If he was still adjusting documentation after the lawyer's hesitation, then this wasn't just about a past mistake. It was an unfolding one. And for the first time since my grandmother's will had been read, I understood something clearly. This wasn't about protection. It was about concealment. I sat across from my independent attorney 3 days after the fundraiser. My grandmother's trust documents spread neatly between us like evidence in a case I never wanted to build. Her office overlooked Camelback Mountain, all glass and sunlight. But my hands were cold as I passed her the bank's authorization logs and the revised collateral filing. They updated this after the lender review was triggered, I said. She adjusted her glasses and read in silence for several minutes. If your digital acknowledgement was obtained without full disclosure, she said finally, and especially if metadata shows irregular authentication, that strengthens your position significantly. My position, I repeated softly. Yes, she said. Your inheritance is separate property. And if it was leveraged without informed consent, that's not simply a marital disagreement. That's potential fraud. The word didn't scare me anymore. It steadied me. She advised me to request formal copies of all communications between Ethan and the lender tied to the loan, including any reference to my guarantor status. She also told me to preserve every email, every text message, every calendar entry that mentioned mediation or collateral. This is documentation, she said, not revenge. Documentation is protection. When I left her office, something inside me had shifted. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. That night, Ethan was waiting in the kitchen when I came home. You went to see another lawyer, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, I replied, setting my bag down calmly. He let out a breath through his nose. Do you understand what that looks like? Investors are already nervous. The Christmas fundraiser was supposed to stabilize things, not create more family drama. I met his eyes. Transparency isn't drama. You stood up in front of donors and said your inheritance wasn't being transferred. He snapped. That undermined everything. I said nothing that wasn't true. He stepped closer. You're jeopardizing the family business. My inheritance was never collateral for the family business, I said evenly. At least not with my informed consent. His face hardened. You're acting like I stole from you. I'm acting like my separate property was used without my understanding. I said, there's a difference. The word separate seemed to irritate him more than anything else. Later that evening, Patricia called. I hear you've retained independent counsel, she said. Yes. A pause. Lauren. Escalation will damage the foundation's reputation. Donors dislike instability. With respect, I replied. My inheritance is not a public relations tool. She sighed softly. If you continue down this path, You may find yourself excluded from future board decisions. There it was again. Excluded. I felt the old version of myself flinch at that word. The one who feared losing belonging. But that version was fading. I'm comfortable with that, I said quietly. 2 days later, the bank responded to my formal request. They confirmed that a revised collateral document had been uploaded after Daniel halted the transfer meeting. The timestamp was clear. It occurred the same afternoon, less than 2 hours after Ethan left the lawyer's office. He hadn't waited. He had tried to fix it, or conceal it. My attorney submitted a written objection to the lender, disputing the validity of my guarantor authorization and requesting full review of the authentication process. The response came faster than I expected. The lender initiated an internal compliance investigation. When Ethan received the notice, I watched the color drain from his face the way it had from Daniel's. You contacted the bank, he said flatly. Yes. You could have handled this privately. You already handled it privately, I replied. For the first time. He didn't have a smooth answer ready. The compliance letter stated that if irregularities were confirmed, the matter could be referred for civil review. Not criminal. Not yet. But serious enough? That evening, he accused me of destroying everything. I built this from nothing, he said. Do you think investors will trust me after this? I folded my hands on the table. Steady. They should have trusted you before you used my inheritance as leverage. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing. It was temporary. Once mediation resolved, I would have untangled it. You don't untangle something you never had the right to tie in the first place. Silence fell between us. The Christmas lights Patricia had insisted we install early still glowed along the windows. Warm and artificial. 2 days later, another letter arrived. If the authorization discrepancy could not be resolved with satisfactory documentation, the lender reserved the right to pursue corrective action and notify relevant regulatory bodies. External systems were now involved. Not family pressure. Not whispered expectations about legacy. Real oversight. Ethan stared at the letter as if it had personally betrayed him. You're turning this into a war, he said. No, I answered calmly. You turned my inheritance into collateral. He looked at me differently then. Not with anger, with uncertainty. For months, he had believed I would fold under pressure, lawsuit threats, judge references, foundation optics, donor expectations. But I wasn't folding. And for the first time, I realized something that felt almost like relief. I wasn't destroying anything. I was refusing to be collateral. The letter from the bank arrived on a Tuesday morning. Thick cream envelope. My name printed in precise black ink. I stood at the kitchen counter and opened it slowly. The compliance department had completed its preliminary review. The digital authorization tied to my guarantor status lacked full authentication safeguards. The routing data did not match my personal device history. Further documentation was being requested from Ethan. My inheritance was temporarily removed from active collateral consideration, pending clarification. I read the paragraph twice. Removed. For the first time in months, I felt oxygen fill my lungs without resistance. Ethan came into the kitchen halfway through my second reading. He saw the envelope and stopped. What is it? He asked. They're reviewing the authorization, I said evenly. They've frozen enforcement tied to my account. His jaw tightened. It's procedural. It's serious, I replied. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. You escalated this. I protected myself. 2 days later, his mediation session with the development partner began. I didn't attend. But I didn't need to. The tension in the house was enough. His phone buzzed constantly. Short replies. Sharp tones. That evening he returned later than usual. Tie loosened, face drawn. They're questioning the collateral structure, he muttered. Your objection made it worse. My objection exposed it, I said quietly. He slammed his briefcase onto the table. You could have handled this privately instead of turning it into family drama. Family drama. The phrase felt smaller now than it once had. Using my separate property without informed consent isn't drama, I said. It's betrayal. He looked at me as if I had crossed a line. It was just business pressure, he said. You think investors care about emotional nuance? This wasn't nuance, I replied. It was my inheritance. He didn't answer. The next week, my attorney forwarded a formal notice from the bank's legal team. They required Ethan to provide documentation validating the guarantor authorization. If discrepancies remained unresolved, the matter could be referred for civil determination. Civil determination. A judge. Public record. The words echoed in my head long after I closed the email. That night, I filed for legal separation. The decision didn't come with fireworks or screaming. It came with a quiet signature in my attorney's office and a weight lifting from my shoulders. We structured the filing carefully. My inheritance and all trust assets were clearly identified as separate property. We requested financial transparency regarding all loans tied to my name. When Ethan was served, he stared at the envelope in disbelief. You're actually doing this, he said. Yes, I replied. You'd end a marriage over paperwork. I held his gaze. I'm ending it over deception. Patricia called the following morning. I asked Ethan what happened, she said, her voice thinner than usual. He told me it was a misunderstanding. Was it? I asked. There was a pause. I knew he was under pressure, she admitted quietly. Investors were threatening to pull back. I didn't realize he had structured things that way. You encouraged the transfer. I reminded her. I encouraged stability, she said. The foundation cannot be associated with scandal. Scandal. So that was the real fear. I won't be signing anything, I said calmly. I understand, she replied, though her tone suggested she understood consequences more than principles. Over the next several days, rumors moved through the family business. Investors grew cautious. One of Ethan's minor backers withdrew tentative support pending clarity around the collateral dispute. For years, Ethan had controlled every narrative, every presentation, every boardroom explanation. Now the narrative was slipping beyond his reach. One evening he approached me again, quieter this time. If you withdraw the objection, he said, we can minimize damage. Mediation might settle cleanly. You're asking me to legitimize something I didn't agree to, I said. I'm asking you to protect what we built. What we built, I repeated softly. Or what you leveraged. He had no answer. I realized then that I wasn't arguing to save the marriage anymore. I was asserting a boundary I should have drawn months ago. Trust cannot survive manipulation layered with urgency. It cannot survive midnight clicks disguised as routine compliance. A week later, my attorney informed me that if the lender escalated the matter further, the question of authorization could be reviewed by a civil judge. If that happened, everything would become part of public record. For a moment, I imagined Ethan sitting in a courtroom explaining how my inheritance became collateral without my informed consent. He had believed I would stay silent to preserve his image. He had believed unity meant compliance. But unity without honesty is control. As I stood in the quiet of the house that no longer felt like home, I understood something with painful clarity. For months, Ethan thought he controlled the outcome. Now the outcome was moving toward a courtroom door neither of us could close. And once that door opened, it would not be my inheritance on trial. It would be his decisions. 6 months later, the silence in my townhouse felt different from the silence in that lawyer's office. This one was earned. Morning light poured through the wide kitchen windows, spilling across a small oak table that belonged only to me. No foundation board folders. No donor seating charts. No development blueprints stacked beside a coffee cup. Just my laptop, my financial statements, and a quiet sense of control. My inheritance sat exactly where my grandmother intended it to be, untouched, clearly defined as separate property, reinforced by the trust she had built years before she passed. The lender's investigation had concluded what my attorney suspected from the beginning. The digital authorization tied to my guarantor status lacked proper authentication safeguards. In careful, clinical language, They removed my account from collateral exposure. They never used the word fraud directly in the final notice. They didn't have to. Ethan's mediation with his development partner settled under strained terms. He retained partial control of the project, but only after restructuring debt and surrendering a significant portion of projected profits. Investors tightened oversight. Lenders imposed stricter reporting conditions. He called it business recalibration. I called it consequence. The legal separation I filed transitioned quietly into divorce proceedings. There was no courtroom explosion, no shouting in front of a judge. Just paperwork, disclosures, and the steady unraveling of what I had once believed was a shared future. My trust assets remained intact, clearly acknowledged as separate property under court review. That clarity gave me something I hadn't realized I'd lost during the marriage. My name back. Ethan asked to meet one final time before documents were finalized. We sat across from each other in a neutral conference room. Not unlike Daniel's office months earlier. It was pressure, he said. Investors were pulling back. The lawsuit threat was real. I made a miscalculation. You made a decision, I corrected quietly. I thought you trusted me. I did, I said. That's why it worked. He didn't argue after that. Trust without transparency isn't loyalty. It's leverage. Patricia stepped down from several public roles within the Whitfield Foundation shortly after the lender review became known among board members. The foundation restructured governance policies to distance itself from any direct ties to Ethan's commercial projects. She sent me a handwritten note. I'm sorry this became larger than family. I understood what she meant. Reputation had always been her currency. But my inheritance had never been a branding strategy. I chose not to rejoin the foundation board. Instead, I allocated a portion of my inheritance to launch a small financial literacy initiative for women navigating divorce, inheritance, and late-in-life financial transitions. It wasn't flashy. No gala, no donor walls, just workshops, clear contracts, and the kind of information I wish someone had insisted I read more closely. My minority share in the Sedona Boutique Hotel was restructured under a new operating agreement that excluded Ethan entirely. That clause felt symbolic. Clean. Final. The first time I visited the property after everything settled, I stood on the balcony overlooking the red rocks and felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Not victory. Not revenge in the cinematic sense. Just peace. Revenge, I learned, doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like documentation, boundaries, a refusal to sign under pressure, a calm voice in a room where everyone expects you to fold. The tables turned the moment I stopped trying to preserve his image and started protecting my own future. A year after the meeting in Daniel's office, Christmas arrived again. I hosted a small gathering in my townhouse. A few friends, warm food, soft music. No speeches about legacy. No strategic narratives about stability. At one point, I stood by the window watching the lights reflect against the desert night and thought about my grandmother. She hadn't left me nearly $900,000 to fund someone else's risk. She left it to give me security. And security, I realized, isn't selfish. Separate property isn't selfish. Asking questions before signing your name isn't betrayal. Love that demands silence in the face of injustice is not protection. It's control. If you've ever been handed a document and told you had no choice but to sign, I hope you pause. If you've ever been told that unity requires you to give up clarity, I hope you ask for details anyway. If you've ever felt financial pressure disguised as loyalty, know this. Boundaries are not revenge. They are self-respect. And if this story felt familiar, if inheritance, family drama, betrayal, or hidden financial manipulation have touched your life in any way, share your experience in the comments. Your voice might be the warning someone else needs. Stay with this channel if you believe strength sometimes begins with a single refused signature. There are more stories like this about inheritance, trust, family business conflicts, and the quiet ways women reclaim power when the world expects them to stay silent. Because I didn't lose my inheritance in that lawyer's office. I lost the illusion that love without boundaries is safe. And losing that illusion was the first thing I've ever signed that truly set me free.